It's a privilege to be here this morning and to speak and to share my perspective. And I want to, just two quick remarks, actually, before I begin. The first one is this, is that I want to be speaking from a very limited and narrow lens, which is a black perspective, a Christian perspective, but it's not generic, it is my perspective. And I want to follow also in the footsteps of those who've already come before in this series of Real Talk. And some of them have been described as having shared some really, they've put themselves out there and they've put their perspectives out there with a sense of courageous vulnerability. And so I want to do that this morning as well. I want to put myself out there and be vulnerable as I share from my perspective. I wrote in my journal the other day that living in South Africa is like having a front row seat, to an orchestra that's playing an uncoordinated symphony. Because in the new South Africa, in many ways, I'm so grateful for the opportunity that when my daughters are of age, there are real opportunities for me to put them in good schools. But at the same time, I live with the shock of just recently finding out that, the primary schools that I went to in Gia and Dilai, in Bushbuckridge are still, they still need, safe toilet for the kids, amongst other, basic things. 1 minute in South Africa, I really envy the confidence that many white people have in the way they express themselves, sometimes translated into the ability to walk barefoot in a shopping mall, which is fantastic. But on the next minute, I find myself wanting to clap, many of them because of the way they speak, to an elderly black mother because of her economic, status. The other day, I laughed out loud when a white friend of mine joked that I was a disgrace to my stereotype because I couldn't pick a lock, and I found that, quite hilarious. But my laughter was in many ways punctuated by, this haunting images of black security guards when they follow me around in shops sometimes with, some of their suspicious glances. And I, in turn, sort of posture myself, trying to communicate subliminally to them, I'm not like those other blacks, as to say that. And the moment I say that, that aura of treason begins to wash over me. Because I also, in the same light, accept those other compliments from some other white people who say, well, you speak so well, you're so educated. And I can almost hear, it being whispered in brackets, although it's not said, not like those other blacks as well. On a bad day, I do honestly want to ship out, all the white people and all the Zulus to Europe. I just figured... the reason I throw in Zulus is just because I know it seems like white people are afraid of, Zulus, so I wouldn't want their trip to be comfortable, so I throw in the Zulus in there as well. But on a good day, I thank God honestly for being part of a country where, I have friends. I know the wealth of having friends in almost all across the entire spectrum of our rainbow nation. I grew up in Bushbuckridge. My mother was a nurse, so you could say, that I grew up in black privilege, because having a parent who is either a nurse or a teacher, something like that in a rural community for us, was it meant that you were special, at least in my group of friends. It meant, for me, my privilege meant that I could get special favors from some of my friends, by virtue of the fact that I always promised them things month end. When my mother gets paid, you'll get this and that. And it worked. It gave me some great leverage. But also it meant that I could afford certain toys that my friends could not. I had a soccer ball. We loved playing soccer in my little community we called it Health Center, named after the clinic around the corner. And so in Health Center, we played soccer, on the streets that were carpeted with dust and stones and, broken bottles. But we loved playing barefoot soccer on those streets, and it was amazing. And, I discovered quite early that I was really a good soccer player. In fact, I was the best in my group of friends. Because when I looked at the people that I admired, the best dribblers in my community amongst my friends, they could never ever dribble me. And it was an amazing fact. And I figured I was the best soccer player then, until one day, through a misguided program, a social responsibility program of some sort, Coca-Cola decided to come to my area and hand out some free soccer balls to all the kids in my community. On that day, that fateful day, it was one of the most terrible days of my childhood life, because I discovered that actually I was dribbleable after all. I discovered that my soccer skills were quite mediocre, actually, and because the fact was this: it seems like the kids in my community had conspired and decided that they wouldn't dribble me, since it was my soccer ball that we had been playing with, lest I get angry and take it away. And they were right, because I wouldn't have had anything to do with them if they did that. But on that day, I learned several lessons. I learned, like I said, that I was dribbleable after all. But I also learned that, even though hard work and individual skills and talent played a big part in determining, apparent success of individuals, but resources are also extremely important. I learned that, that resources played a big role, that even though our starting point may look like they're the same, they're not the same if our resources are not the same. And it's a point that I wish many of my white friends, could understand, that to admit white privilege is not the same as denying hard work or individual skill or talent at all, but it's just to admit a fact about the playing field. I worked at UKZN on the Westville campus for many years as a chaplain, and working there seemed to really increase my angst on this particular issue, because year after year I stared something in the face that I later got to label, the plight of the black student. Because the average student that I walked with, arrived at the university already having, conquered such tremendous, against such tremendous odds, stacked mercilessly, against them, having come from schools that celebrated the few that had made it to university in the first place, schools which were often under-resourced, with teachers who were hardworking, great hearts, but often insufficiently trained, at least in preparing them for the university life. But he makes it nonetheless. That student that I worked with, which represented majority of the people, made it nonetheless. But when he makes it, then the real fight begins, because he has to fight the discouragement, he has to fight the long queues, in the Durban sun, in that context, often for several days, just to try and get a form, for student loan. And when he gets that form, he has to beat the challenge of finding an uncle or a pastor or some relative, to sign surety, to stand surety for him. But when he beats that, then there's a disorganization at the university to find residents. And when he wins over that, 3 weeks later, after, lectures have officially commenced, then another battle begins. Because now he has to fight the language barrier, the workload that high school didn't really prepare him for. Then there's social pressures, some really ill attitudes also. He has to win over some ill attitudes of some lecturers who are really proud at the fact that it's rumored, that their causes have a reputation for producing high failure rate, often, reflected in the black student population. But then he wins over that, and he has to keep on winning and beating those cues year after year, until finally he has, a brush with the appeals process, which he has to also win, because once he wins the appeals process, then he can at least register on his third year without having to pay, 40,000 rands, which he has no idea where he's going to get it from. But he wins, and finally he graduates through many supplementary exams 6 years later for a 3-year degree. But when he wins, then he has to beat the discouragement, because when he stands on a podium like this and we congratulate him, we say, well done, we give him 2 pieces of paper. If he's lucky, the one is his certificate of completion, and the other is his 100,000 plus bill that he needs to settle. Now we say, well done, all you need to do is just to get a job, put a wall around your mother's house or a roof, a decent roof, so that you can at least be comfortable that at home, they're sleeping under a decent roof. You have to send some money, so make sure people eat at home. And maybe there might be some siblings in there that might need your help in going through school so that we can break the cycle of poverty. So after sending that, and maybe you might need to also, on top of that, start saving up for lobola if he's a guy, so that he can get married. But when he gets to work, when work begins, then he's measured with the same stick along the white graduate who's just had their own struggles in their own right up to this point, but socially and economically speaking, you can't really compare the two. Then I've had so many countless phone calls from these graduates after that, complaining, not knowing what to do, to please their bosses, because they've worked so hard, they're trying to work so hard, but despite the fact they're trying to overwork to try and prove themselves, but there's still this deep distrust, being labeled as being lazy because they're black, because they're expected to be lazy. In such a mess, you cannot build a society, I think, in my opinion, with tolerance as the highest virtue. Tolerance does not necessarily have to listen or understand. Tolerance does not have to cross its own boundaries to go to another. It merely ceases hostility. You cannot build a type of society that at least I have in mind as a thriving society with the ethic of non-engagement like tolerance. You need something more. You need something deeper, something patient, something kind, something that is not arrogant, something that is not rude, something that does not just insist on having its own way for the sake of it, something that's not irritable or resentful, something that does not rejoice at wrongdoing but rejoices and works with truth, something that bears all things, something that believes all things, something that hopes all things and endures all things, particularly on behalf of another. And in the wake of our colonial and apartheid history, we have enemies that are too numerous to count and too vague to clearly define. So we need an ethic that does not only give us the ability to identify our enemies, but also the one that says you don't have to in order for you to be free from the clutches of your enemies, real and perceived. Because sometimes fear and suspicion can create and add perceived enemies to real ones. So we need something that can help us rise above that. So my first point here would be that in our race dialogue, we need love that goes beyond our neighbor and embraces our enemy as well. Jesus had such a unique ethic when he taught his followers to, as we heard earlier, love their enemies, to pray for their enemies, to bless their enemies. A message that would be water to a parched land that had been dried out by the many hurts of the present, but also, the past. Speaking yesterday to one of the workers at the B&B where I stay, I asked him a very interesting question. I said, if I could take your white boss right now and place him in front of you, and you could say anything to him without fear of consequence, what would you say to him? What would be the most important thing for him to know? He dusted his hands, very serious all of a sudden, even though we're having a light-hearted conversation. He straightened himself to full height as he dusted his hands over his blue overalls. And he used his hands, focusing on my face, looking me straight in the eye. And at that moment, I really could feel that I had, substituted his white boss, and I was standing in that moment. And he said these words to this effect: "Meneer, I wish I could call you Meneer because I respect you as an equal, not because I fear you or think that you're superior to me. I wish I had a job that could provide for my family adequately, that my children would respect me, that my dignity as an African black man may be affirmed. I wish that we joked together as men, not like how you joke with your children, especially when you speak about my wife." I once attended a service at a predominantly white church, and a lady stood up to announce what they were doing, that they were doing their part, to give back to their community or previously disadvantaged communities that were attached, to them as a church. And they had organized some domestic workers, she said, into a choir because they noticed that these women loved singing. And I remember as these women in the evening just got up to perform, one of the things that she said that really stung me, and as she described what they were actually doing, because she said that, in organizing them into a choir, we had given them culture. Now, I truly believe that this woman had a great heart, and but that her guilt was presumption, at least thinking about it in the best way possible. But often, we do well, to know that we need help. And I often hear this from many of my white friends, help us whiteys, as a friendly way of saying it. And many of you have said that to me, actually. But I think what we don't do well after recognizing that we need help is that we need to take it one step further, because then we also need to say we need help to know what we need help with. Because we can do the wrong thing with the right heart, and that could lead into what Busi here, who really had a meaningful comment to what I said yesterday that really shaped a lot of what I'm saying here today as well. It could lead to infantizing people, where we look at people and we say, here, let me help you. Let me tell you what you need help with, and let me tell you how I'm going to help you. Doing the right thing, on the other hand, with the wrong heart also can have devastating effects for our community, because you need the right motivation to match your right actions. Sensible policy is one of the most important remedies for our country, but it can only go so far. For instance, you can argue successfully, as I think we did with Johan on that trip to Porch, about affirmative action, as restorative action to counter the systemic, evils of racism and its consequences in society. But arguing and implementing policy is not necessarily the same as fostering an environment for thriving relationships between people who would not naturally get along. Because on one end, you could have a white graduate who is distrustful, who's angry, who's fearful about the future because of a perception that they'll always be overlooked for a job just because they're white when they're standing next to another black person. And on the other hand, you can have a black graduate who's just really grateful for the opportunity to play on the level field, and bringing them together is not the same just as fostering just that environment or controlling that environment just through policy. You need something a little bit more. So my second point would be this, that in our race dialogue, we need the right motivation, fueling the right kind of actions. And it is this critical balance that between motivation and action that I found again as a Christian in the person of Christ. In contrast to a religion in which the devotees aspire to a certain kind of behavior in a hope that maybe they would get a commendation from their God. Christian ethics grow out of a personal relationship with the person of Christ. And it's a relationship based on, the forgiveness of sins and on an implicit trust in the mercy and the grace of Christ. Having acknowledged Him as Lord and Savior, then His followers then commit to follow in His ways. And then every command that He then gives, that when He says, love your enemies, pray for your enemies, bless your enemies, do not curse, is undergirded by that your sins are forgiven. In a race dialogue, and this is my final point, we need new hearts that are empowered towards healthy relationships. According, again, to Jesus' view of reality, prejudice, segregation, hatred are in the human heart. That the heart of man finds itself in a broken world, at war with God, at war with itself, at war with others. And Jesus offers Himself as a remedy to give a new heart that is reconciled with God, reconciled within itself, and is being reconciled with itself and with others. It is exactly that kind of hope that I think we need in a race dialogue of a democratic, post-colonial, and I also say post-heroic South Africa. We saw a political miracle, where there wasn't much bloodshed when there was expected to be. And however, that miracle, for many people is very suspicious. Who thought freedom is coming, change is coming alongside freedom. And then they left and then went back into their shacks. And 21 years later, they feel stood up by that kind of change, even though they got political freedom. The time to look, I think, towards individual human heroes, who come once in a lifetime, once in a generation is over. The time to look towards a government as the savior has to come to an end, I think. We need something of a collective with new hearts working together. Well, how do I envisage this happening? I say, let's mobilize our communities to do good things in this country. Let's educate our domestic workers and contribute towards their formal education and their children's education where applicable. Let's group ourselves into families of 10, into families of 20, and adopt burdens of schools in townships and rural areas. Let's conduct businesses in ways that's not only for maximum profit, but for maximum good, maximum healing, maximum reconciliation, maximum transformation. Let the bottom line be assessed in the currency of people. If you're part of the white church, let's just stop seeing black people as boxes to tick, or numbers to add to some trending diversity in our services. Let's see them as equals, people with whom you can have a meal with outside the walls of the Sunday service building. Invite black people to your homes and invite yourselves to their homes, because that's how it works with black people. You invite yourself to their homes, you get at the gate on your phone and you say, I'm here. As bosses and colleagues, let's listen and understand. Let's accommodate one another. Let's not accommodate complacency and laziness. That's not what I'm saying. But let's make sure that those labels are not only in our minds and are only activated, when we see particular people of particular, skin colors. White employers, there are some of us, who have been taught that it's rude to nominate yourself. So next time, you ask for somebody to lead and you see my hand down, don't just assume that I don't take the initiative. Ask me. Give me an opportunity. I'm more than a BEE partner and a box to tick. I am your equal. Ladies and gentlemen, ours is a painful past. It's a painful present still for many people. But I think that it doesn't have to be a painful future. It can be a hopeful future, but that hope needs to be anchored in reality. And as a Christian, I find that Jesus offers, such an anchor. Peace with God, peace with ourselves, and peace with one another. And out of that can flow some really good actions, right motivation that fuel right actions together for the betterment of our society, for the common good. Thank you very much for your attention.